Thank you very much for this opportunity to share the Philippine experience in transport operations during the pandemic and under the new normal. But before I start my sharing of our experience, let me just give a context of urban transportation planning in the Philippines. Just like the rest of the world, where more than 50% of the world's population are now residing in cities, the Philippines has followed suit in 2015. About 49% of its population are now residing in urban centers. In Metro Manila, where the capital of the Philippines, the population density is about 20,785 persons per square kilometer, compared to the national average of 337 persons per square kilometer. So that's how dense our cities are. And based on a study that was conducted for the Philippines in 2017, the cost of congestion is about 3.5 billion pesos daily. And then it can grow to about 5.4 billion pesos. And oh, sorry, I should have converted that to dollars, but that only means that we are reaping at the seams already because of the burgeoning population that we have. Also, under the old normal, we already had problems with inadequate public transport capacity. Just to note, the Philippines, the average modal share of public transport is 70%. So therefore, what we'd like to see, just to understand how the pandemic affected us, it's just important for us to have a sense of how inadequate it was even before the pandemic, right? A study that was also done pre-pandemic showed that there were long waiting hours. A study that was conducted back in 2015 showed that waiting time can range between 1 minute to 2 hours. So that's a wide variation of waiting time. Also, when people were able to get on the rides, they would endure long travel times that are basically a waste of time due to congestion. There are lost times here that could be translated to more productive use if people arrived in their workplaces, schools, or even at homes. Also, before the pandemic, the reason I am contextualizing all this is because I'd like to just highlight what we did during the pandemic. All right, so before the pandemic, our drivers, basically our jeepney drivers, earned based on the number of passengers they carried. So they're non-salaried. Bulk of their pay is based on the number of passengers that they carried. So therefore, you would see, if you've seen videos of traffic in the Philippines, you would see that you'd have haphazard movement from inner lanes to outer lanes, just because our drivers are competing for passengers. And also, the drivers work for 13 to 15 hours a day just to get the minimum take-home pay. Yeah, so we have a lot of risky behavior to pick up passengers. Also, before the pandemic, we already had problems as far as the environment is concerned. Based on a 2010 study, gas inventory, GHG inventory in 2010, transport ranked third highest emitter, highest contributor, next to agriculture sector and energy sector. All right, so further, even within the transportation sector, road-based transport contributed highest to the emission. And then the pandemic came. So while we were sleeping back in 2020, March 16, 2020, the president of the Philippines imposed enhanced community quarantine. That means lockdown and stringent social distancing measures in Luzon. Now, the suspension of that means that all modes of transport halted: land, air, water. There was no movement actually. And I think that must be the same for some parts of. And also we've seen shifting, of course. Analysis of the mobility data provided by Google shows the drop in movement to transit stations due to halting of public transport. Metro Manila's level was way worse than the national average. All right. Now there was one of course, one silver lining, because during the pandemic, because there were no movements of people, air quality significantly improved during the enhanced community quarantine, with 54% reduction in particulate matter. Of course, uh, once we shifted back to post-ECQ levels, this has also started to increase. But it was really not just the commuters that were um, that were that were reeling under the impacts of the pandemic. Also, during the pandemic, we had problems because there was a lockdown, and even when we eased into, post ECQ, there were less number of people who would ride the jeepneys because work was not yet open. Not all of the establishments were still open. A lot of work from home was still in place. So part of the social problem we've had was that our jeepney drivers also suffered from lack of earnings because they, as I've mentioned earlier, they earn based on passenger kilometers. So as we moved to the new normal, there's a two-pronged objective as public as transportation moves into, gradually opens up. So the two-pronged objective, of course, efficiency, which means to meet mobility requirement of the commuting public and ensure unhampered movement of goods, and safety to control the spread of the virus through the reduction of transmission by implementation of stringent health and sanitary protocols. Now you can just imagine how this stringent protocols was also increasing waiting time, because boarding time was also lengthened, right? So this is just a snapshot of how we gradually move from enhanced community quarantine to general community quarantine. So what did we do? There were two things we did to address the issue of the lack of earnings for the drivers. The government launched the service contracting. This was funded by the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act. It's a legislation that was put in place so that we can fund the service contracting of public transportation. As I've mentioned earlier, the drivers actually, before the pandemic, earned based on the passenger kilometers. Under the service contracting, the government will contract operators and drivers to render public transportation services based on vehicle kilometers. I think this is one of the, in other parts of the world, this is already done, but in the Philippines, this has been hard starting. This was something that was talked about, but, never put in place. But the pandemic actually gave, tragic as it may have been, also gave an opportunity to put this in place. The two types of contract that the government offered, but we first started with gross contracting, gross service contracting. So the performance-based contract, vehicle kilometers operated. The service contracting was seen to also increase reliability of public transport services, because as I've mentioned, the drivers did not want to ply the streets anymore because of low income. Okay. The benefits of service contracting, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, this is something that's known to a lot of you, the stable income despite the reduction in load factor. So as I've mentioned, we've got gross contracting. The drivers actually get their own, the drivers will keep their revenues, and we will pay for the shortfall, and also reasonable working hours. For the commuters, of course, predictable service because of the headways and safe travel due to standard. Well, this was the vision, the safe travel due to the standards for driver behavior as condition of the contract. There was also a feedback mechanism for improvement of service. Another thing that was also noticed during the pandemic was an increase in the number of people who biked to work because of the scarcity of public transportation. So because of the pandemic, the department strongly encouraged cycling, and other modes of non-motorized transport and personal mobility devices as an alternative travel mode to implement social distancing. It worked with the Department of Local Government, Interior and Local Government, and the Department of Public Works and the Department of Health, so in the implementation of their bikeways. The bikeways was also the construction of the bikeways was also funded, was also allocated a budget under the same act, the Bayanihan to Heal Us one, the second one, the Bayanihan two, for the construction of bike lanes. To date, we have actually constructed 561 kilometers of bike lanes built across 3 cities, Manila, Cebu, and Davao. And the bike lanes also, as you can see, have different classifications because these are built along major thoroughfares, right? So this is class 1, class 2, where they have physical separators, and class 3. Okay, so different classes depending on the kind of vehicles, the roadways that they were built on. We also undertook an information and education campaign to promote road sharing. All right, so good. That means that there was an uptake and there was an increased uptake of of active transport. Now, so we wanted to find out how, how women felt about the shift to active transport, the option for the option to bike to work. So we asked them what would encourage them to bike more. Based on the quick poll that we did when we did the Women on the Go webinar, there were two things that was top: provision of safe, connected, and cycling routes. And the second one is enforcing lower speed limits and other traffic safety policies so that they feel safer when they're actually biking on shared spaces. The the top interventions that were identified for people to walk more would be provision of safe, well-connected walking route network with supporting infrastructure, as well as amenity improvement like well-lit covered walks and signages. I'd also like to just share with you that even before the pandemic, we were already looking at how to improve, how to actually improve the linking of land use and transport by developing compact, walkable, mixed-use communities around a mass transportation system. We look at it as a 10-minute walk around the transport station. Locally, we're now looking at how this strategy can be pursued by integrating it into the comprehensive land use plan, which are done by the cities, by the cities and the local government units. Every so often, that's their plan. So moving forward, these have been the policies that I think should be sustained. First, we build on the gains in improving public transportation operations. As I've mentioned earlier, the Philippines were still really highly dependent on public transportation. Earlier in the, even from yesterday's talk, one of the problems that the participants were talking about was how to bring back the level of demand, to public transportation. That's not a problem for us. When we opened public transportation, we had the same problem as before. We've had inadequate capacity. So we have to build gains on improving public transportation. We're actually continuing with service contracting. We're also strengthening the digital platform for automatic fare collection system. I don't know if you've noticed that in the picture I showed earlier about the driver, it was the driver that was also collecting fares, which is another safety risk for public transport in the Philippines. One of the things we're also looking at is to connect micromobility. So if having bicycle parking areas at major stations, so the people would have direct access to public transport stations. The second policy that we looked at is the sustained development of infrastructure and supportive culture of active transport. Infrastructure is really not enough. You actually need to increase awareness of people and respect for cyclists. And this is especially important in the Philippines, where there's competition for space between bicycles and motorcycles, right? In fact, uh, initial because we've had this bike lanes, initial data was seen. Initial data showed that there was a lot more conflict between these bicycles and motorcycles rather than bicycles and four-wheeled vehicles. Another one, of course, is to support, is to move towards land use transport planning, and as well as to adopt alternative working schemes like a 4-day work week, a flexible working hours. This has been recently legislated um, by the Civil Service Commission. Of course, piece of data in planning transport systems is very important because right now in the Philippines, when we look at traffic data, we remove cycling trips and walk trips. So we're now putting that back into the equation. We're now talking about that. All right, so thank you very much. And I hope I have been able to just share the experience we've had in the Philippines. Thank you.